Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the 68th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our panel discussion twice monthly to provide an example of how civil discourse can produce clarity and understanding when seeking common ground. Today, our panel will discuss the oldest argument in psychology. Which has the greatest influence on human behavior, nature or nurture? More specifically, should courts decide cases based on the life circumstances of the defendant? Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left is Jerry Ritzman, chairman of the board of Ritzman Pharmacies. On his left is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services. We'll begin our panel discussion with Dr. Chamberlin. Ron, recent news has covered the case of a young man from a wealthy white family who killed 4 people and injured 9 others in a drunk driving accident. He pled guilty to 4 counts of intoxication manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years probation. The judge accepted the defense that his affluent upbringing kept him from knowing the difference between right and wrong. Does this sound to you like the court is factoring out free will in its decisions?
John, I don't know whether that's one question or a bunch of questions that are stated different ways. But
well, that's a good answer.
Any of us who have any contact with children, whether as parents or just yelling at that bratty kid next door, have our theories about how children should be raised. And one of the oldest ones is the tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slate, where a child is born with nothing there, and it's up to you to write on that and lead them, or as the twig is bent, so the tree inclines, or spare the rod and spoil the child. And I don't know whether this is a liberal conservative situation or not. There was all the Benjamin Spock stuff where the child was left to take their own way, and minimum for the parents is for today's helicopter parents, where they're hovering over and trying to guide them all the way. But legally, well, the audience should know that our motto, John, you send us usually some background material that you may have happened to find. That's usually very helpful, and this affluence thing is pretty interesting. Courts seem to be divided on this. A child from a poor upbringing, from a ghetto neighborhood, is sometimes maybe cut a little bit of slack because they didn't have a good upbringing, or maybe not. In the case you sent some of the background information, this same judge had sentenced a young black man who had killed 1 person to a lengthy term in prison, whereas this rich young white man who killed a number of people while drunk was let off with probation. Now, he recently, of course, violated his probation and got his mommy to drive him to Mexico, where they, of course, ordered a pizza with their cell phone and got caught. So, criminals aren't necessarily smart. But, so, yeah, the judge didn't allow for nurture, but I think there's enough studies of knowing how people are wired, genetically, to know that there's a strong influence in your nature, that there is a background there that nurture builds on. In this particular case, the parents are certainly at fault here. They apparently are amoral individuals, just have no sense of what's right and wrong, or any ability to teach this to their kid, if they even wanted to. It doesn't sound like they did. So yeah, I don't think the judge did take quite enough allowance for how this kid was, or probably, I'm coming down on the side that maybe they should be a little harsher on the kid, or at least during his probation. I don't know if they gave him any opportunity to get family counseling here to try to teach the whole family what was going wrong or not. But certainly that would seem like a first choice of something to do here. Yeah, I think the court should take allowance for the circumstance of the individual, but courts also need to, I think, realize that people are ultimately responsible for their own actions. And you have to do that if you're not trained the right way. I think society owes it to itself to help train people, to help educate people in how to behave in a responsible manner.
So our free will prevails no matter how we've been conditioned.
It doesn't necessarily prevail, but it needs to be accounted for, and it needs to be nurtured.
Yeah. Jerry, what do you think?
Well, let's start.
I'm sorry, did I frighten you?
Oh, no, I'm fine.
You're awake, Jerry.
I'm fine, I'm awake now. Right. Let's first do the nurture versus nature thing. As far as behavior, let's step back and look at physical attributes and so forth, or abilities in a person. And certainly there's a lot of difference in nature between individuals. If somebody is particularly agile, quick, athletic, and so forth, that is their nature. If those abilities are not nurtured in a certain way, they won't express themselves in a particular activity and so forth. So, yeah, they're basically there, but how are those particular natures nurtured? We'll see how they're expressed. So, if we have somebody that has particular abilities and they are nurtured toward a particular activity, we will see different results from different individuals.
Yeah.
And so because we can see that physically, it seems to me that you could also see that in other behavioral traits, whether it be selfishness, whether it be altruism, or things like that. If they were nurtured, had that in their nature and were nurtured that way, they would probably be expressed that way. Let's take a look at so Ron, you're advocating for a good dose of relativism when we go to the courts, rather than these are the rules and the laws by which society acts, and we all need to be held to those same standards. So you would be able to hold me to a different standard than you in a particular case because my upbringing was different. And that to me,
I'm not sure I really mean that,
but that's kind of what I heard you say, is that the court should take
good starting point.
The court should say, gosh, Jerry was raised differently, so we'll forgive him of this, but Ron wasn't, so we won't forgive him of this. And then pretty soon society is to think, well, you know, I've got no, it's all relative. It's nothing black and white, and I don't know what to expect from these folks. So I can say that how a person is raised certainly will have an effect on how they will act. If somebody is raised in a family that reads a book to a child from when they're an infant up, by the time that child is 2 years old, he or she knows that you hold the book this way and you start turning the pages like this. You could have a 10-year-old who never had a book in the house, and you hand them a book and they don't know which is up, down, front, or back. So I'm just taking that example to other things. You have a child who has been in a family where nobody has held a job, and they've not seen that person have to hold to a particular schedule or get up in the morning and go to work and that type of thing. And then they're thrown in the workforce when they're of age or out for looking at a job, and they have no idea that, you know, I've got to go to work 5 days this week. And even if I don't want to go, I've got to go to keep my job. Now, if we had relativism in that case, what would an employer do? They would say, well, this person's family, he didn't see that example growing up, so we'll let him go. Well, I mean, we'll let that pass, and they can show up whenever they want. So the things that we observe in our upbringing and the things that we are taught in our upbringing certainly will have effect on what our behavior is. But should we excuse that? Should we make allowance for that? In society as a whole, I think not. In the workplace as a whole, I think not. On an individual one-on-one basis, I think we could. If it's a personal relationship. That's my ruminations here, and I know I'm kind of theoretical, but that's where I am.
Patty, what do you think as a former teacher and former of students' personalities?
It was always interesting because you would see groups, I'd see siblings come in, and they would be different like night and day. And it was amazing. They would come from the same family, assumedly the same upbringing, and yet their behaviors, their intellectual levels, all of these things could be quite different. I even had twins in class where in the case of twins, when I had twins, if they were good kids, they were both good kids. But intellectually, the one could be very bright and the other
You're not talking about identicals, though, are you?
In some cases, it was identical.
Really?
Yeah.
And very different from each other?
And very different from each other, which is kind of contrary to everything that I read about twins. But you wonder, okay, is it just genes then? But I think the nurture part has to come into play as well. One of the things I found, though, that was interesting, especially when we talk about this affluenza case, is that there's really, it shows that nurture and nature only have a profound effect on people at their young age. And the older they get, the less effect those have upon the performance or the levels of that particular person. Mm-hmm. And at that point, free will becomes more important as to how they decide and act upon different things. You don't see these automatic, they come from the poor family, therefore they end up this way. There are cases. I think that whole idea, though, is the fact that I like to say that kids are kind of half-baked. They're not fully cooked yet.
They weren't in the oven long enough?
They weren't, well, they haven't been in the oven long enough. And because of that, they don't always have the opportunity to make correct free will decisions, which is why we have a juvenile court system, that we treat these kids that aren't fully cooked a little differently than we treat the adult who does have that free will and has had all of the training supposedly that they need to make correct decisions, which I think is part of what happened here. I mean, the big discussion now in this influenza case is whether this young man will go back and be treated by the juvenile court system, because he was a juvenile at the time. Although 17, I think he was 17 when he did this, and I'm not so sure 17 is not.
Now, recent studies are showing our brains aren't fully developed till we're around 25.
Right. But you see some 17-year-olds and you think, oh, they look like an adult, so they should be treated as such. Yeah. But they want to move him into the adult courts. Now, whether anybody wants to, agree with the decisions or not, there's only so much they can do to him. They could put him back in, they could extend his probation, but they could make it an adult court. Makes it difficult, but not that bad. I think the most time he can serve was 3 or 4 months. I'm not sure if anybody saw how much in jail. It's not like he's going to go to jail for 10 years because of this, whether he goes to juvenile or to adult court.
Are you talking about just this case or all juveniles?
In that case. Just this case, yes. And well, in most juvenile cases, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe if you're sentenced to jail, it's not, unless you're tried as an adult, you are sent to juvenile jail, and you are immediately released upon reaching age, is it 18 or 21?
I think it changes from time to time. I think it's 18. Yeah.
And so, you can't give a 20-year sentence to a juvenile. So once that decision is made to try someone as a juvenile, the court's hands are tied as far as what they can do.
Yeah.
But again, I think we do that because of the fact that these kids really in some cases, cannot be totally held responsible for their actions. In this case, I think the parents did a worse job, and I hate when parents are blamed for everything. Sometimes you do the best job you can, and your kid just does something wrong, and you can't
do it. There's a movie in the late 50s called The Bad Seed.
Oh my gosh, Patty McCormick, yes. Yes, I remember that film.
Push grandma down the steps.
Oh yes, exactly. But yeah. So,
Bryan, what are your thoughts?
Well, on the affluenza, I'm going to call psychobabble on that.
Are you really?
Yeah, I just really have an issue when individuals look for an excuse. It used to be, the pendulum has swung so far now It used to be that, like you had mentioned, in the courts, you take a young man or young woman, comes from a poor upbringing, their whole nature, their environment creates this issue. The court now takes a look and says, okay, we're going to do this instead of, why. We're going to be lenient on that individual. Now it's gone so far over that someone that has been raised with every possible advantage, and this young man came from a very wealthy family, went to the best schools, and clearly acted out of his own motivation. He'd been on probation. He'd had skirmishes with the law before. He was familiar with the juvenile courts. Here he goes out while he's on probation, takes his dad's truck, buys liquor. They've got him on tape with 5 or 6 of his friends, and goes out and kills 4 people. Right. My solution is, even though we can't keep him in prison up here, we slow walk his extradition papers, because he's sitting in Mexico. He's sitting in a Mexican jail. Let him experience.
Okay.
Yes, he is.
He's not at the resort anymore.
Oh, no. He's not in Puerto Vallarta anymore. His mom is back, and he's down there in Mexico. And my feeling is, we let him sit down there and let him experience what a real prison system is like, and then bring him back. He will kiss the ground when he hits the United States, because he'll go into a prison system that actually really wants to help that individual. Where down in Mexico, that's not happening. Okay. But this notion, I fall back on my parenting. There's rules, boundaries, and limitations. And I agree with Patty. Every child is different. But when you give opportunity, like this young man had opportunity, whether it's a young man or young woman or whatever, and they just sort of spit in the wind, I don't see how he got out of not serving some sort of jail time up here. And the judge that sat on that case, he or she, I think it's a lady.
It's a woman.
She retired shortly thereafter. I don't think she belongs on the bench, because I would agree, that young man that sat before her several years before, that black young man that killed 1 person, he went to prison.
Was he tried as an adult?
He must have been, because he went to prison.
No, actually, in that case, the judge ruled the same thing for the black youth as she did the white youth. Sentenced to rehab, extensive rehab. Now here's the other side of that story. In the case of the white youth with wealthy parents, they agreed to pay $36,000, I believe, a month for his rehab. No rehab program would take the black youth. She had sentenced them the same. They had no choice but to give him the 10-year prison sentence, because he could not be put on probation, because he was not accepted into any of the...
So was he in an adult prison?
I don't know. I have an idea that he's not until he's 18, but he's probably past 18.
But he's still incarcerated.
He is in a juvenile system. But one of the things we have to remember, though, the juvenile system is all oriented toward rehabilitation. Right. The adult system is oriented toward punishment. Before we overjudge or prejudge the judge, it's important to recognize what her job was. Her job was to try to rehabilitate this young man in the best way possible. Now, of course, we don't have I haven't seen at least any details at all about how he was really raised. Was it just because his dad made a lot of money? I mean, does that explain everything?
Well, if you buy into the affluenza argument, and that is a defense, you have to. I mean, the website that you sent us to, the lady that has sort of championed this affluenza, her father or grandfather was a chairman of General Motors at one time, and all the problems that money had brought onto her, and the burden that she had to bear because she was so wealthy. I find that hard to believe. And here was a young man that had ample opportunity to correct his life. He blew through his probation. He wouldn't stay. I mean, $36,000 a month, that sounds like a pretty good gig. I mean, that's probably 5-star hotel. Yeah, you can't leave the campus, but it's a pretty good sized campus. I can't imagine it's anything like a federal prison. You know, we talk about these federal prisoners that go away to Camp Fed, and it's sort of like real nice, and they get 3 square meals a day, and they do exercises, and they talk about their life, and you know, they have moments where they can do yoga and all that stuff. I can't imagine it. $36,000 a month.
If that's what, please don't quote me on that. You've done it twice now, and I'd rather you not, because I'm not sure.
The one I read,
it was a large amount.
The one I read, it was almost $3,000 a month, and he left. He he left it. He wouldn't stay. So rules, boundaries, and limitations, there's plenty of room for individuals, but in this particular case, this young man should not have been. I mean, if half of the stuff is true.
You know, I thought I read that one article about the affluenza, though, is that it doesn't just affect those that are rich, that those that are poor can be affected by affluenza if they are, you know.
It depends on your attitude toward money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That
There's all
was
these
the
stories
whole
about
thing.
lottery winners who just go down the tubes
Oh,
until they get the
absolutely.
money.
Oh,
you
my
know?
gosh,
Don't know
yeah.
how to handle it.
There was
I'd like the opportunity myself.
Well, you'll have it on Friday night, isn't it? Friday or Saturday?
right?
$650
this
million
time I will buy
or
one.
something, so.
Joe Gibbs, who was the head coach of the Washington Redskins for a long time, he left the coaching profession, and he formed the Joe Gibbs NASCAR racing team or something like that. But he's got a personal ministry. He ministers to athletes about how to live their life after football or whatever. And a startling statistic that again, I may not be exactly right on the numbers, but it's going to be close, that 65% of professional athletes are bankrupt 5 years after they retire. These are multimillionaires.
That's interesting.
Yeah, their decision making, and it's his ministry to try to teach them how to manage their lives in a better way. Like somebody has done, obviously, with LeBron James.
You know, I
remarkable.
think they did say that he was being mentored
Yes.
when he first came to the cast to make, because they knew this could be a disaster otherwise.
He was worth $90 million before he got out of high school.
Right out the get-go,
Yeah, but yeah.
One thing too is I don't want to push Dr. Ben Carson on anybody, but I'm not really actually in his camp when it comes in. But he has a very compelling story.
Yeah.
He was raised, I believe, in Detroit to a single mother who basically, in the worst possible environment,
Yeah.
who basically told him, she laid down the law. She was working several jobs. She said, you're going to bring books home. You're going to study. There's going to be no TV. And here he ends up being a very successful surgeon.
And she herself was illiterate.
And she couldn't, So right there, to me, when you start talking about nurture and nature, I mean, and some of the stories that he shares with people, if half of them are true, it's amazing he made it out of that ghetto. But here, parent, saying to the kids, no, this is how it's going to be, and here's what you're going to do, and you're going to look to the future. This isn't your life, and move forward. I think that's what makes all the difference. That's why when I read these stories about this young man, I feel sorry for him. I'm angry with the parents because they enabled that young man to continue with those behaviors.
Yeah.
And if he continues, though, I mean, if this man does not get his life together, that's though I think when free will kicks in, because he had that growing period. He didn't have the right training as he should have, but people are trying to give it to him, and unless he's open to that, and unless he makes the conscious effort to become a useful citizen, he's never going to be. If he thinks mommy and daddy are going to bail him out the rest of his life.
Well, there's the gap between absolutism and relativism in the courts, and that's where the judge takes place. If we do all this mandatory sentencing laws, why even have a judge?
Right.
You find the facts, the judge has no page.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that's where the judge is to make that judgment. Should we give this kid a break? Should we give this person a break the first time around? Or is this a fifth offense and we've had it with the guy, so we're going to do it? So that's where the judges take place, I believe.
Which brings
so that kind of reconciles us, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which brings me around to a point that we can discuss here for a couple of minutes. And that is how we make decisions about cases like this that we hear about. I call it the breaking news syndrome, where people hear a breaking news and they've made up their mind about something, and if the rest of the data does not support their bias, it doesn't exist. But in this case, there were 30,000 people signed a petition against this judge because what they heard was, a rich white kid got off easy and a poor black kid got sent
Right.
to prison. That was all.
Didn't look at any of the details.
Didn't look at the rest of the information. And how many times we have people making decisions like that, and it turns into policy. And I think it's those kinds of decisions based on people seeing breaking news, making a decision that leads us to things like mandatory sentencing.
You know, even when I watched, I mean, when this case first came out, they said this young man broke his probation. I do not know the terms of his probation, but they were showing him, they were playing beer pong, and the one guy came in. I assumed for the longest time that the kid they were talking about was the one that was sliding across the table. It wasn't. He was standing off to the side
Cheering.
cheering without a drink in his hand. And I'm thinking, okay, there has to be something more to this. But just seeing that and not identifying who it was, I'm thinking, oh, this is an idiot, you know.
Yeah.
Can somebody enlighten me? What the heck is beer pong?
Well, having never played the game.
No, Patty. Come on, Patty.
An observer, right?
You
Patty?
set
have
up,
a table and
you set up cups. So this is what I've been told. You set up cups with beer in them in like a bowling pin setup, you know, in a
Oh,
pyramid.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, in a triangle shape, and you have them on both ends, and then you shoot. You take a ping pong ball and you throw it, and if it lands in the cup that it landed in, that person has to drink the rest of the beer that's in that cup. You win when you get rid of all the opponent's cups.
What is the business about sliding across the table there?
That had nothing to do with it.
It was probably at the end of the game.
Yeah, I'm sure
He was losing and he was drunk. And
Yeah.
Okay,
decided
but
to,
you see, that makes me one of the breaking news people because I thought that beer pong was sliding across the table and trying to knock over bottles of
not
beer.
that I've heard. Yeah, not that I've heard.
Okay, well. Thank you very much.
Just
And
like-
We have a
discussion.
table here.
Well,
Next time,
John,
Patty, you
next
can
time.
demonstrate.
Send
I'm
it
gonna
out
have
to
some.
Viewership will
Right.
spike.
Right.
Okay. You know, I wrote down 3 quotes, and I thought I'd pick the one that applied best. And this is from Michael D. Montaigne. Nothing is so firmly believed as that which little is known. Think about that for a little
Yeah.
bit. And thank you very much.